After World War II, New York quickly became the capital of modern art, supplanting Paris. Artists such as Mondrian and Max Ernst had made New York their home. The presence of major European artists like them gave American artists a new intimacy with the avant-garde ideas of abstraction and surrealism. New York also became the emerging capital of world art because it had collectors willing to invest in art and artists, such as Peggy Guggenheim, who founded the Guggenheim Museum of Art. All of this led to America becoming the world leader by the 1950s in modernism and abstract expressionism, becoming the most influential avant-garde of that time period. So, abstract expressionism. We're looking here at Jackson Pollock, one of the most famous abstract expressionists. What do we see? A tangle of lines, splatters, drips, a monochromatic palette of black, white, beige. There really isn't a composition. Instead, there's a field of kinetic energy transmitted through calligraphic marks. The swirls of paint express the traces of the artist's act of flinging paint in a rhythmic dance of gesture and response. Pollock, like other artists of his generation, was deeply involved in the new ideas brought by European avant-gardists like Piet Mondrian. So here was one of the great figures of pure abstraction. And in 1942, he's living in New York and he's taking his abstract language of elemental geometry and pure colors and giving it a new American inflection with citing Broadway and suggesting the grid of New York City streets, and then the other part of the title, Boogie Woogie, popular American music. So he's showing artists like Pollock that it is possible to treat the canvas as an all-over field rather than a pictorial space, and to be thinking in terms of movement and rhythm and what is peculiarly American. Surrealism was equally or perhaps even more influential on Pollock and his abstract expressionist peers. Surrealism was spectacularly prominent in New York, in America, in the 1930s into the 40s. Numerous surrealist artists had escaped Nazi-occupied France to settle in New York as exiles. There were so many of them exhibiting art that there were even cartoons that made surrealist jokes in magazines like The New Yorker. Another touchstone for Pollock was absolutely the kind of fecund creative regeneration and stylistic renewal that Picasso was constantly doing and was partly created through his engagement with the idea of primitivism. Primitivism was tied to questions about the innate psychology of human beings. It looked to cultures that were not part of the modern industrial societies to search for the fundamentals of spiritual and cultural conditions of human beings. There was a popular discussion in the 30s and 40s about the difference between so-called modern man and so-called primitive man. They didn't use the word woman. This involved an ambiguity and uncertainty about whether modern life had alienated human beings from their ancestral vitality, their essential vitality, or whether the irrational parts of the human mind represented a reservoir of uncontrollable impulses. For artists, so-called primitive cultures had kept alive a primordial vitality that was perhaps lost in the modern world. So this is the idea that the Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam expresses in his work The Jungle. The bodies are distorted, abstracted, carved into elongated, simplified forms, as if they are living sculptures. Lam drew on Afro-Cuban art forms to give a vision of humans as powerfully imaginative. Pollock was also deeply engaged with this discourse on the primitive versus the modern mind, which were assumed to be different minds. This is in no way actual, true evolutionary science. This is rather kind of the ideas that were popularly in play. So Pollock in thinking about the primitive, was interested in it because it spoke to his sense of the modern world as causing psychological distress, which he experienced personally, and his interest in artworks that seemed to give a primeval energy of human mind and body. He read closely a writer named John Graham, who had published an article in 1937 on, quote, Picasso and primitivism. That was its title. That article discussed the ways that African masks had liberated Picasso's art. And Graham's article included a photograph of this very powerful sculpture, which is a mask created by an anonymous Eskimo artist from the Hooper Bay region. So just as Picasso had appropriated the forms of the African mask, Pollock used this Eskimo mask as a generating motif. We see how it's being repeated as a kind of, as I'm saying, generating form and symbol in his 1941 painting. This is titled Birth. By this point, Pollock had been undergoing psychotherapy in the Jungian tradition. Carl Jung, unlike Freud, saw the unconscious mind as being accessible through archetypal imagery. He felt that the mind spoke in poetic, mythical archetypes. So Jungian analysis involves close scrutiny of dreams and fantasies to unravel fears and desires. It deals in symbols about birth and death, imagery of the moon and the sun, the animal and the vegetable world. And this pushed Pollock to think in terms of primal symbols expressing psychological material. So Guardians of the Secret in 1943 is an important transitional painting for Pollock. He is definitely thinking still in terms of symbolic imagery and symbols that evoke the operations of the unconscious mind. So here we have embodied these vertical forms that evoke guardian figures arranged around a central panel. Below that panel, a wolf-like creature seems to crouch in wait. And then there are forms that evoked faces or masks. They're hovering above. So there's a theme of the hidden and the revealed. And there are all these coarse paint strokes evoking both of those tendencies. Some seem to be inscriptions that would perhaps communicate what's going on, or are they actually crossing out and covering over? It's ambiguous. The strokes seem to be doing both. So Pollock is in a liminal space between an art that uses symbolic forms and an emerging new art that focuses on gestural mark making. And this is going to become an art where he will, as he says, choose to veil the imagery. So here we see 1950, the painting Autumn Rhythm, and we see what he means by veiling the imagery. It is now purely abstract. We are no longer decoding pictorial symbol. So this idea Pollock had that he was going to choose to veil the imagery is hugely important, because by 1950 he has stepped into a purely abstract painting. There is no decoding of pictorial symbols. Instead, we have a kind of a palimpsest of painterly movement, of paint flung and swooshed and swung and swirling, a layering of impulses and reactions. That's a very powerful metaphor for mind. But it is also about paint itself and the act of painting. The painting is the recording of the tracing of a series of actions. And so this painting, this kind of painting that Pollock develops, will be called action painting at the time, not just abstract expressionism. And it was the critic Rosenberg who coined this term. But in 1950, the idea that this is action painting. He said, at a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object actual or imagined. Pollock may be the foremost practitioner or example of this idea of an arena in which to act, because one of his key ideas, his key moves, was to take the painting from the vertical plane of the easel or wall and put it down on the floor, horizontal, underfoot, relating the body of the painter to the act of moving across the field of space that is the canvas. In March of 1941, the new Museum of Modern Art held an exhibition titled Indian Art of the United States. As part of that exhibition, Navajo artists created sand paintings in the Navajo sand painting tradition, and Pollock saw that. So here we see a photograph from that exhibition, and we see one of the Navajo artists working in relationship to the ground, sitting within the space that becomes the sand painting and creating on the ground. Very different than the kind of upright viewing position and making position of the European tradition. In the Navajo tradition, the sand painting is created as a spiritual practice, which is also a healing practice. The artist is a medicine man who is creating a kind of a world in miniature, by which I mean the space of the painting, that is a kind of cosmic condensation that creates a space for healing. This certainly captured Pollock's imagination. When he spoke about wanting to make a painting for the age of the atom bomb and the radio, he is articulating an idea that modernity has been a process of trauma. That's the invocation of the atom bomb, this immense trauma. And there is in his painting a quality of remaking art from the ground up to rebuild a traumatized collective consciousness. And we have a sense that the painting underfoot being made from this process of moving paint in an exploratory fashion, that this is almost rebuilding the idea of art, of a painting language from ground up. Of course, ground zero is a term that goes back to the dropping of the atomic bomb. Ground zero, the center of the explosive radioactive destruction. So Jackson Pollock is often seen as the greatest of the abstract expressionists, and I'm making the case here as we look at all of these elements that contributed to an artwork like Autumn Rhythm, to him developing this vision. I'm making the case that is because great art is about taking so many elements and kind of putting them together in this chemical chain reaction that creates something entirely new, that yet brings together so many things. So there's a quality in great art of it being inexhaustible, and of it being something that actually reaches out and touches so many different cultural arenas. This is the same kind of reason why Jacob Lawrence is so significant.